I'm super excited to chat with you guys about Web 3.0, the new stack. Kind of want to give us a second to like think back first, back to 2014, early days. Around that time, Gavin Wood wrote a post on what Web 3.0 looks like. And I think it's really funny to look back then at kind of what we envisioned way in the early days that Web 3.0 was going to entail, and all that has evolved since then, and all that maybe we would add now looking back at that initial definition. And so he defined 4 components of the Web 3.0 stack: a static content publication system, way to publish and retrieve content by its hash, dynamic messaging system for P2P networking, a way to do trustless transactions with a consensus engine, and the integrated user interface to bring it all together, do name resolution, and like find and access and browse content. So that's like a pretty good, 4 major components of Web 3.0. And I think we've seen a lot of that evolve over the past 6 years since 2014, and that was written. Back then, I think it was like highlighting things like BitTorrent and Namecoin and a couple of other things as like the be all end all of those components. But I'm curious for this group, like, how have these concepts evolved in the past 6 years? How have you seen those things change? And what maybe would we retroactively go back and add to Gavin's definition that we think is missing important components that make up the Web 3.0 stack now?
I can just jump in and give you my kind of experience from the time that you're mentioning till now. So when I first kind of got into the space, I did see the Web 3.0 kind of stack evolving, and the general principle of it, which is kind of what got me into the space to begin with. Back then, I was looking into Ethereum, and Swarm was available. So Swarm was kind of going to be is the file storage layer inside of Ethereum, and it allowed you to do static hosting of like dApps and JavaScript things. And at the time, I was kind of like, look, we've got it. You can have a Swarm client running. You can go instead of connecting via like the basic internet, you can connect via Swarm, and you can access a dApp, and everything was kind of working as you'd expect. But some of the major issues kind of started coming up throughout the years, which in particular one was scaling in terms of having fast transactions at to incentivize the economic storage of files and all that kind of things in Swarm. So over the years, as all the technology has kind of grown, I found myself, I now work in Ethereum too, specifically in the networking layer. So fundamentally for Web3, we need to, one of the components that we need to kind of advance is the networking layer. So in the traditional kind of web stack, we've got like a client server architecture, and we now shifted over into peer-to-peer networks. So that's specifically kind of where I'm working in Ethereum too. And I guess the main shift that I've seen since when I started is the research, protocol labs, and pretty much the entire community putting into peer-to-peer networks to try and change the fundamental dynamics of how computers interact. And that's like one of the core backbones for building like a decentralized Web3. So we're still doing that today, but we're significantly closer, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And kind of the modularity in there is actually a really interesting component of like, making it so that more things are plug and playable. Like that's one of the cool parts of libp2p in particular, is just like all of the, the flexibility that it gives developers to grab the pieces that they need and contribute back ways that they augment and improve them to kind of a central networking layer that everyone can improve and everyone can augment and use in their own ways. So I think that's super cool in the work you guys are doing.
Yeah, that's right. It's not enough to build one application that works really well on a peer-to-peer layer. It's better to build a tooling or infrastructure so that everyone else can do it, so that we have an actual ecosystem of Web 3.0.
Usually. Curious, Andrew, Dietrich, if you guys have thoughts about either how things evolved or what you maybe think is missing from Gavin's definition.
I can toss a couple out there, just things that I think are really big, speaking of elephants in the room, that I don't think we have necessarily solutions for. I I know a lot of people, a lot of projects are still working on the user model for Web3. I think it's a really tricky subject, and I'm not sure there's any clear sort of winning model yet that's going to help us there. But like the amount that I still move through the internet, signing into applications and services using a handful of user model, user identity, user security providers, that's a really big thing that we still need to figure out. And another one is the index. I think Google still has, you know, the best searchable index on the internet, and I think that's a really that has a really good role for us to be able to discover things on the internet. But it's not going to be the only index. I think that there's a lot of work still to be done to figure out how we can build sort of powerful knowledge aggregation systems on top of these Web3 protocols. And I'm curious to see what people build as things like Filecoin become real, open data sets become sort of available over Filecoin APIs, indices start getting built there. Something I've had a lot of conversations with teams about is like before, when data storage was a limiting sort of factor in what you'd build, you'd store raw data and you would create, sort of products on top of that through compute. And now if you can think of the world having sort of a boundless hard drive, we can think of storing every facet of that data. We can build indices that we also store and we also share. And it can actually break that model of having to have a singular sort of index creator and provider. We can all be index creators and providers. I'm not sure what that looks like. And I'm not sure where it could go, but it seems like an interesting other piece there. Those are two that were on my mind.
I think that latter one is fascinating to me. Like we kind of, the cooperative nature of building resilient networks is kind of implicit in these architectures. And what you're talking about is something that's more explicit. And with centralized infrastructure, you get that explicit by default. Like it comes with the company that built the thing, right? And that's not the nature of how these applications work are going to stay resilient online and immediately useful to end users. So I think from like, how do we articulate the explicit nature of cooperative computing in our application model and in our stack is going to be a really, really important part of what that new stack is. When onboarding the next, 100,000 or million developers, these are the things that are pretty well developed and articulated in the old stack, but aren't so clear in the new stack. When like you say, when we are both the provider and the consumer, those boundaries aren't as clear, and the responsibilities of ownership and also some of the threat model in there as well about our participation in that network aren't as well articulated. So I think finding out what those things are and making them explicit is going to be a key part of that new stack.
I agree. I think we're tapping into this idea that like integrated user interface is actually probably a lot more in there, a lot more complex than like just name resolution. There's a lot of additional pieces in there, from like, the user model to how, how you think about externalizing information to people who are consuming services. I think Textile is actually also a great example of something that doesn't clearly fall into one of the categories that was initially proposed, but is like super critical. All of that like tooling and infrastructure and things that make it extensible to build on from a development perspective that have gotten, and Fura is also a great example of like infrastructure providers that are layering on things that empower a whole new kind of ecosystem of development on top. And that I don't think falls super easily into the previous encapsulation of the world, but is like so critical for what Web 3.0 wants to engender, which is a whole teeming ecosystem of people building on top of it. So kudos to you guys, and excited for also like more things of that nature that like empower other groups.
Well, yeah, actually, I think that's an interesting distinction, because what Gavin is talking about is like a world where the switch is already flipped over. And I think what a lot of what we've the sort of space that we envision Textile sitting is when that switch is still sliding over. And so what's really cool about Web3 and building on it as a company is you can actually build things that you imagine being useless in the future, but necessary now. And so you're not actually building APIs that necessarily have to guard themselves. So like APIs on Textile, we're not trying to build them in a way that protects them and locks users and applications in. We're trying to build them as APIs that move the ideas to these new protocols and these new systems more quickly. And so it's sort of like a temporary state, which I think is interesting. And he doesn't really cover as kind of like one of those necessary steps to get there, but that's a lot of where we see ourselves right now.
That's super cool. Adrian, I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of the transitionary or like things that kind of like move people from like one, because since you've been around in this space, like and pushing forward on it for a while, like, you know, the things that like help tip the next block and like move the ecosystem forward. So even as we iterate and cycle through solutions, the kind of finding a way to evolve through that, even as we kind of set down previous things and move on to new ones. I'm curious how you've seen that evolve as well.
Yeah, I think Andrew's kind of encapsulated quite well, but we're fundamentally changing from the lowest level, how the computers are actually interacting with each other compared to the current internet. So that kind of ripples itself up as to some of the points that Andrew's talking about, so that the way that you're actually going to have to use the system is going to be fundamentally different. So it's going to be, I think, as Andrew's saying, you got to take some steps to transition people from how they're currently using the internet and the general ideas of how the applications that they're using at the moment, how they work. You can easily search things, all these kinds of things have to fundamentally shift because we're changing the fundamental, just literally the way that these things kind of interact. So yeah, maybe we have to build some kind of, like kind of transition or like extra layers on top that kind of mask some of how these things operate underneath, so that users can gradually step until they become more comfortable, and then we can take it from there as they get used to kind of the new way of doing things.
Building things for upgradability. Love it.
I think one of the challenges in that transition is around how do you protect end users? Like this, how do you communicate the transitional nature of the technologies that they're using? So while these architectures bring new capabilities and kind of superpowers, as we've talked about in some of the earlier talks this week, they also bring new threats and challenges. And the delegated trust of the HTTP web means that a lot of that UI and that communication and the design of security UI is also delegated to browser vendors and how they protect users. And there aren't well-established ways of communicating the relative threat from a privacy and surveillance standpoint. And we've also, by giving the trust model directly into the hands of end users, we have given them maybe a foot gun in some respect. We found from basic things like, I dropped my phone with my keys into the ocean, but also increasingly the safety of the data that they're encrypting. So from one part of, like, when we talk about stacks, oftentimes we're talking about libraries, architectures, what is the new OSI layer, but design and communication is left for something as an exercise that comes after that. And oftentimes maybe the model should be flipped, and how do things like anti-surveillance get baked into this stack, I think, is going to be something that is, like, now that we know those threats in the old web, how have we designed for those threats in the new stack? And that's going to be a really big responsibility when you're talking about how do you get the first billion end users on Web3.
Yeah, along that topic, I'm super curious about kind of the areas of Web3 that we see evolving super quickly right now that are hot areas to watch, or that need additional investment and involvement. Like Dietrich, what you're mentioning sounds like definitely one of those areas where so critical to be thinking through the problems methodically before we just default solution and then end up with it baked into a stack with a whole ton of bad ripple effects. And so curious if other folks have either areas in the Web3 stack world that are making really cool forward progress, or need additional help to make that progress really thoughtfully. One I'll throw out there is definitely in the past year, seeing kind of the development around web applications and kind of the building up Web3 websites, made a giant leap forward, I feel, over the past year. Sleek, Unstoppable Domains, ENS, like a ton of these groups just made it like 10x easier to go and put up your first website on the DWeb. Like it was definitely possible before, but now it's just like has the tooling, the infrastructure, the developer UX around like just making it happen. Like 3Blocks did a lot of stuff around deblogging as well. Like it's become much more accessible for people to do that. And so that's one of those areas where it feels like things are, moved like a whole leap forward exceedingly quickly, which was super interesting.
Yeah, I can't not say it. I've been working on Ethereum 2 for the last 2 years, so I might as well. Everyone's heard it. Scalability, right? So layer 2 solutions and everything has kind of grown. I've been working on Ethereum 2 for the last 2 years. So scalability is one of the things that we've specifically been trying to focus on. All the latest next gen blockchains are all focusing on scalability. So I think that's one key aspect that's also going to help. So hopefully Ethereum 2, when it gets launched, will add to that.
Hugely. Andrew?
Well, this is just kind of an area I'm like excited now that you're sort of pointing out this like 10x improvement we've seen in some of the basic patterns of using some of these protocols. The next area that I'm really focused on, and I'm excited to see projects starting in, is actually getting these things integrated into tools and systems that people are already using. I think that a lot of development in the space has been to build things totally new. And I think that's really great for creativity and exploration of what the limits of these protocols are. But I also think that there's just a huge opportunity to go to where users already exist and find pathways to integrate and give them new capabilities, new services, new values in those places. And so we've been really trying to encourage teams to look at, what are the open source tools? What are the open source networks where we could add something and do small integrations and get people exposed to this stuff? And I think this is the year that stuff's really going to happen, because we're already seeing projects do that. And so some of those are going to take off, and we're going to see not only 10x usability, but 10x usage really quickly. And it's going to be because of those inroads, and I'm really excited for that.
I mean, making use of all of your scalability, Adrian.
Yeah, I really second that. I think like the success of the new stack depends on its ability to bring people with it and to bring people in. One of the things that we're doing to be able to get basic IPFS libraries functional inside existing frameworks, like some of the work that we're having to do for React Native support, is really upstreaming some changes that some of these communities have needed for a while. So there are really opportunities that Web3 projects can bring to existing really large developer communities that both bring some of the benefits of our architectures and exposure and visibility into those communities, and along with participation and engaging them by giving back into them. So looking for those opportunities where you can kind of get that double win is really important for both credibility and engagement.
Totally. I feel like, Dietrich, you guys have also done awesome work on kind of the browser side of things, also taking the portal through which many people access the web and equipping that with more tools and more support for a lot of the Web3 protocols that are happening here. So like ENS and Unstoppable Domains both got support in Opera, and so did IPFS. And so now there's much more ways to like directly go into Web3, even without having to download like 5 different applications that you've never heard of. Like it's actually getting baked into our portal, into the internet, which is super cool. And I feel like that's a growing trend and an area that'll spark a lot more accessibility into what's happening here.
Yeah, I think we're really just on the cusp of that too. We're getting to the point where, like when you say install multiple applications, I think one of the end user experience goals that we have for people on Web3 and distributed applications is to not have to have that install step, and as much as it is possible to do so. We're going to see probably more native integrations in 2021 for sure into browsers, and more removing some of the paper cuts of integration of hybrid applications. So where you access it, like it's a lot of the applications that we've seen the last couple of days are distributed applications that you access through the HTTP web. That's going to be in a hybrid state that we're going to be at for a while. So if we can remove paper cuts in that and make those applications work a little bit more smoothly in that transition, that's going to help everybody, developers and users alike. The work that we've done with Agalia is landing some of the fixes in Chromium and in Firefox to be able to make today's browsers work better with local nodes that are running simultaneously, and also things like the protocol handler work that we've done in Chromium to be able to register non-HTTP protocols is going to make it easier for regular Web 2 application developers and builders to be able to migrate and transition reasonably and smoothly to Web 3, removing as much friction as we can there.
Super awesome. I love it. Well,
Yeah. On
where
that
do we
note,
have?
one of the
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just really quickly. One of the other things that we're trying to encourage and advance is for users to also run their own local nodes, as you said. So as things kind of integrate, one way to do that is to try and slim down the client, so that the clients, you don't have to spend 2 weeks downloading 100 gigabytes of data. If you have a client that can run, and it kind of sits there, you can run it on a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't chew. You don't need to sync millions of gigabytes of data. The way that kind of makes you kind of more secure locally, but it strengthens the peer-to-peer network and the health of the network as well. So that's one way going forward, is to kind of simplify the client so that they can run very locally with minimal resources.
Yeah, I'm sure Andrew can plus one that, but we're definitely finding that a ton on the Filecoin side. Like, what we're 5 days after mainnet launch or something crazy, and like have a 600 petabyte data store and a huge hefty chain, and like all of the things of like a significant blockchain network, that downloading and syncing that from a node perspective is super tricky, and definitely an area that I feel like all blockchains that are contending with, coming up with new solutions for, looking at things like sharding, looking at ways to make that more scalable, is like also an area that's evolving really quickly, and that needs more people pushing on it to kind of help with that accessibility, and more people participating, more light clients, more things that kind of make it less heavy to run blockchain infrastructure as well. Andrew, I know you guys are doing a ton of stuff with like PowerGate and better APIs, so that you don't have to be running your own local node in order to do things as well.
Yeah, that's something that didn't come up with your first question either, is just kind of the whole vision of interoperability. I think so many projects share it, but it isn't a clear path necessarily how we get there. But I think a lot of smart people are working on the problem, so I think there's some promising directions. But that's really related to this problem, because at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter if you run things locally or if you tap into things running remote, as long as you can kind of move seamlessly between them and nobody's forcing you to do it one way or the other. So that you have kind of like options for quick onboarding, you have options for greater sort of personal privacy or security or whatever you're going to get from running things locally, or greater control. But it should be like seamless and be able to move between the two, which I think is like kind of gets to what you're saying, Dietrich, too, where kind of like we have to like live through these gateways for a little bit longer, but not everybody does. Not everybody does. Just doing that the easy way for a lot of people that are trying to onboard quickly or try to figure these things out or get your ideas disseminated to people easily. That's the way to go immediately, but not everybody has to do that. And that's really cool.
The Birdie project, they did an implementation, like a smaller implementation of Go IPFS for embedding in native mobile applications. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was this idea of kind of contextual capability, designing this stack that we talked earlier about, the modularity of this stack. With HTTP and a web rendering engine, that's not really something you can do so much. But here, they played with the idea of, there's like a full node, and then there's HTTP client for an IPFS node. But what are all the different phases in between? And how can you configure the capabilities of the node in a way that's contextual to the end user problem you're trying to solve in your application? So I'm really excited about the work that they're doing there, and figuring out how to kind of make something that is light as possible, but as powerful as possible, that can spin up or down, depending on device capabilities, end user need, available bandwidth, and be able to configure and be able to communicate. And I think this is one of the real challenges, again, when the user is willing to trade any one of those things off. If a node's going to run down your battery, that might be totally fine depending on the user need at the time, and vice versa. And that intersection of where that stack is and how we design these for these capabilities is going to be key to be able to meet that user need. So I think some people are doing some pretty interesting work there.
I like that a lot. The idea of like like we think a lot. I think a core value of like the Web3 space is all around user agency. Like, you know, you as the user have the say in where your data goes, or what you store on your node, or how you configure your own knobs, and then combining that with how you make it accessible so that you know what knobs to configure and you're not overwhelmed by like choice and paralysis. But you can kind of choose from a variety of different ways that you can intersect with a network. Like the thing that springs to mind to me is like the IPFS DHT, and kind of differentiating, you know, do I want to join this DHT as a client or as a server? Am I helping serve content and pinning content and want to be queried a lot? Or do I just want to like ask a few queries because I'm a JavaScript node in a web page and I'm going to disappear any second? And like, that's the interaction model I want to have, and enabling everyone to interoperate, but with varying different capabilities and roles that they're playing in the ecosystem. I think is just a continued pattern that we're seeing. We're going to get, I mean, it'd be really cool to see more research on that space, and like more mapping of like all the different ways that to highlight like, you know, which things should exist that don't exist yet. I feel like there's so much evolution going on that we're going to identify a lot of new maxima that we haven't found yet. So I'm psyched for that, and I feel like there's more to be done in that space as well. Cool. We are just about at time. Anyone have any final parting words? I know this flew by to our audience. Anything about the Web3 stack or our wishes for the future?
Well, I don't know. I think related to all of that, I think of like so many big ambitious projects around, you know, connecting infrastructure and smart cities and remote, these things that are just like streaming data and connecting things in really advanced ways. And I think so much of it comes from a really intelligent workforce and really smart people just thinking about creative new ways of solving problems. And so for this space, I'm really excited because I think we might have just come far enough that I think now we can really disseminate these things, especially into like classrooms, getting people taught about these protocols early on, so that when the next wave of students graduate college, they go off to all kinds of workforces with these, armed with these ideas, and innovate and bring totally new concepts to the space that we're not expecting. We're like so small still, as exciting as everything is, we're like still such a small fraction of the sort of thinkers in the world. And I think there's so much more we can get. So that's above everything else, that's like the exciting next step, I think, is stream and education.
I lost your audio bit at the end, but I completely agree. The idea of like, you know, now is the opportunity to like take the amazing work that we've done so far and like bring it to more people. Like, call to action, go and share this new ecosystem that everyone can participate in, help others learn about it, understand it, build on top of it. That's amazing.